I was born on the 17th day of March, 1869, out on what we called the Whitfield Ranch, about 8 miles east of the Los Angeles Pueblo. My father, Elijah Whitfield, he'd come out from Missouri in '64, right after the war, looking for land and opportunity like so many men did back then. He met my mother, Margaret O'Brien, here in California. Her people were Irish, came around the Horn in the early '50s when she was just a girl. They married in '65, and by the time I came along, they had 240 acres of decent land, 80 head of cattle, and my older brother Theodore. We called him Teddy. He was born in '66. I remember the dust more than anything else, that red dust that would hang in the air on summer afternoons, thick enough you could almost see it moving. The San Gabriel Mountains stood up sharp to the north, and on clear mornings, which was most mornings back then, you could see every ridge and canyon cut into them. We had orange groves on the south portion of the property, and my father kept grapevines on the hillier ground. The oranges did well. I can still smell them when they were in bloom, that sweet smell that would drift through the house at night when the windows were open. It was a quiet life, understand? We'd make the trip into the Pueblo once a week, maybe twice if we needed supplies. That was a 2-hour ride in the wagon, longer if the weather was bad. Los Angeles then? It wasn't anything like what people think of now. There were maybe 5,600 people living there when I was small. Could have been less. The streets were dirt, the buildings mostly adobe, and you heard Spanish just as much as English, probably more. It was still very much a Mexican town, even though it had been American territory for, 20-some years by then. My mother had my sister Nora in '72, so there were 3 of us children growing up on that ranch. We helped with everything. You did back then. By the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I was feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping my mother in the garden. Teddy worked with my father and the cattle. We had 2 ranch hands who came and went, Mexican fellows who knew the land better than my father ever would. Good men, hard workers. I think my first real memory of understanding what Los Angeles was, separate from just being town, was when my father took Teddy and me to a cattle fair at the plaza. I must have been 7. It was 1876, I believe, or maybe '77. The vaqueros were there with their horses, roping and showing off, and I'd never seen so many people gathered in one place. I remember thinking the whole world must be there. The Pueblo itself, it had a character all its own in those days. Olvera Street wasn't a tourist attraction like it became later. It was just the heart of town where the real business happened. The old adobe buildings lined both sides, and you could buy anything you needed if you knew where to look. There was a man I remember quite clearly, Don Vicente Sepulveda, an older California gentleman who sold oranges from a cart near the plaza. He must have been 70 years old when I first knew him, maybe older. He'd been there since before the Americans came, and he loved to tell stories about the Mexican times, about the ranchos and the cattle drives down to San Diego. My mother would buy oranges from him every week, and he'd always slip an extra one to us children and say something kind in Spanish. I didn't understand most of it back then, but I remember his smile, the way his hands were weathered and dark from years in the sun. There was a tienda, a little store, run by Señora Beatriz Moreno. That's where my mother bought fabric and thread, sometimes clay pots or cooking supplies. Señora Moreno was a small woman, very proper, always wore black dresses even in the heat of summer. She taught me words in Spanish while my mother shopped. Naranja for orange, cielo for sky, hermosa for beautiful. I can still hear her voice saying those words. The store smelled like dried chilies and leather, and something sweet I could never quite identify. And then there was Mr. Horace Caldwell, who ran the first American pharmacy on Main Street. He had come from Boston, I believe, and you could hear it in the way he talked, very clipped and proper. He wore spectacles and a vest even in August, and he kept that pharmacy spotless. My father said Mr. Caldwell could compound any medicine you needed, and people trusted him, even the Californios, who didn't always trust the Americans. I started school in 1876 in a one-room schoolhouse about 3 miles from our ranch. There were 23 students, all ages mixed together, some barely 5 years old and others nearly grown. The teacher was Miss Adelaide Thornton, a young woman from Kentucky who'd come west for adventure, I think, or maybe to escape something back home. I never knew which. She was the first American woman I really admired outside my own mother. She was patient and firm at the same time, and she made us believe that education mattered, even out here on what felt like the edge of the world. I attended that school until I was 13, until 1882, and by then I could read and write and cipher better than most girls my age. That same year I started school, 1876, the Southern Pacific Railroad finally reached Los Angeles. I remember my father talking about it with excitement and worry both. "It'll bring people," he said, "and people will bring change." He was right, though it took a few years for us to really see it. At first, it was just easier to ship cattle and oranges, easier to get supplies from San Francisco or back east. But slowly, you'd see strangers in town, men in suits looking at land, talking about opportunities and investments. By the time I was 14, in 1883, I was helping my mother sell eggs and vegetables at the market in town every Saturday. We'd load up the wagon before dawn and make the drive in, and I'd stand there all morning calling out prices, making change, talking to customers. That's when I started to notice how much the town was changing, how many new faces there were, how the conversations were shifting from cattle and crops to railroads and real estate. Then came 1886, and everything accelerated. The boom started, they called it, and suddenly Los Angeles wasn't a sleepy pueblo anymore. The boom of 1886 and 87, it changed everything almost overnight. The population of Los Angeles went from maybe 12,000 people to over 50,000 in just 2 years. You could feel it happening, like watching a river flood. Suddenly there were hotels going up, 3-story buildings where there'd only been single-story adobes, streetcar lines being laid down roads that had been dirt paths just months before. Real estate men were everywhere, knocking on doors, making offers, talking about the future of Southern California like it was some kind of promised land. And I suppose for them it was. They saw opportunity. They saw money to be made. My father started getting offers for our ranch in 1887. The first one was $8,000 for the whole 240 acres. He turned it down without much thought. Then it was $10,000. Then $12,000. Then a man from San Francisco came out and offered $15,500, and I remember my father sitting at the kitchen table that night with my mother, both of them quiet, just looking at that number written on a piece of paper. $15,500. That was more money than we'd see in 10 lifetimes of ranching. But my father shook his head and said, "This land's ours. We built something here." My mother didn't say anything, but I could see the worry in her face. She was thinking about the future, about what would happen if the cattle market went bad, if the orange crop failed, if something happened to my father. And then something did happen. In the winter of 1889, my father had an attack of the heart. He was 51 years old, strong as he'd ever been one day, and the next he was in bed struggling to breathe, his face gray, his hands shaking. The doctor came out from town and said he'd survive, but he needed rest, needed to stop the heavy work. My brother Teddy was 23 by then, and he'd been wanting to move into town for years, wanting to start some kind of business with the building boom. After my father's attack, Teddy started pushing harder. "We should sell," he'd say. "Take the money while it's there before the boom ends. Father can't work the ranch anymore, and I don't want to spend my life herding cattle." I was 20 years old, and I didn't want to sell. I couldn't imagine leaving that land. Couldn't imagine our ranch turned into city lots with houses packed next to each other like I'd seen happening elsewhere. My mother was caught between us, wanting to keep my father safe, wanting to respect what he'd built, but also scared of what would happen if we held on too long. The town kept growing around us. They built Hollenbeck Park in 1892, this beautiful public park with trees and walking paths, and I remember thinking how strange it was to have a planned park when just 10 years before everything had been open land anyway. We didn't need parks. We had the whole countryside. But that was the point, wasn't it? The countryside was disappearing. The subdivisions were spreading out from the center of town like ripples in water. I could stand on our property and see houses where there'd been nothing but chaparral and wild grass. Then in 1893, we had a family meeting. All of us sitting in the parlor on a January evening, cold enough that we had a fire going, and Teddy laid it all out. He'd been talking to buyers, and the offers had gone even higher. $16,800 for the whole property. My father looked older than his 55 years sitting there. He'd never fully recovered from the heart attack, and we all knew it. I spoke up. I said we shouldn't sell everything, that we should hold on to what we could. My sister Nora, she was 21 and engaged to a German fellow, Otto Fischer, who owned a dry goods store in town. She didn't care much either way. She was planning to move to the city anyway. It was Teddy and me who were at odds, and my father in the middle, knowing he didn't have the strength to keep the ranch going himself. Around that same time, I was being courted by a young man named Samuel Harrison. He was a carpenter from Ohio, came out in '91, good-looking fellow, skilled with his hands, and he'd built half the new houses going up in Highland Park. He wanted to marry me, wanted me to move into town with him, start a life there, and I'll be honest, I cared for him, maybe even loved him in my own way. But when he made it clear that marrying him meant leaving the ranch, leaving my family's land, I couldn't do it. I broke off the engagement in the spring of 1893. He didn't understand. He said I was choosing dirt over a future. Maybe I was. I don't know. But it felt like if I left, if I just walked away, then everything my parents had built would disappear even faster. The compromise we reached was this. We sold the southern half of the ranch, 120 acres, in the fall of 1894 for $16,800. That money went into planting more orange groves on the northern half, the part we kept. My father used some of it to hire help, and we made it work. My sister married Otto and moved into a house on Figueroa Street. Teddy took his share and started a lumber supply business that did quite well. And I stayed on the ranch with my mother and father, working the groves, watching the city grow closer every year. My father died in 1897. He was only 59, but his heart had been damaged, and one morning he just didn't wake up. I was 28 years old, and suddenly it was just my mother and me trying to keep the ranch going in a world that didn't seem to want ranches anymore. By 1900, Los Angeles had over 102,000 people living in it. The city had exploded beyond anything my father could have imagined when he first came out from Missouri. The pueblo I'd known as a child was completely gone, swallowed up by this new modern city with electric lights and telephone lines and automobiles starting to appear on the streets alongside the horses and wagons. My mother and I kept the ranch going as best we could, but it was hard work for just the two of us, even with hired help. We focused on the orange groves, which were profitable, and we managed. But I'll admit, it was lonely sometimes. Most of the young women I'd known had married years before, and here I was, nearly 31 years old in 1900, still living on the ranch with my mother, no prospects, no real future I could see clearly. Then, in 1902, I met Joshua Bennett. He came out to look at our property, not to buy it, but because he was an engineer working on the water situation for the city. Los Angeles was growing so fast that they were running out of water, and there was talk of bringing it from somewhere far away, some valley up north. Joshua was 38 years old, a widower. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years before back in Colorado. He was a serious man, quiet but kind, and he knew his work. He'd been hired by the city to help survey and plan what they were calling the Los Angeles Aqueduct, this massive project to bring water from the Owens Valley, 233 miles away, through mountains and desert. He explained it to me one afternoon when he came back to check on something with our water sources, how they'd build this system of pipes and tunnels and siphons to carry water all that distance. I thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. We were married in 1903. I was 34 years old, late for a woman to marry back then, but Joshua didn't care about that. He said he'd lived enough life to know what mattered and what didn't. We kept the ranch, that was important to me, and he respected that. He'd work in the city during the week, living in a boarding house near the engineering offices, and come out to the ranch on weekends. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but it worked for us. We had our daughter Ruth in 1904, and our son Samuel in 1906, and suddenly the ranch felt full of life again in a way it hadn't since I was a child. Joshua was part of the team that built that aqueduct, and I watched it happen over 5 years, from 1908 to 1913. He'd come home and tell me about the challenges, the 5,000 men working on it, the tunnels they had to bore through mountains, the sections of pipe they had to lay across the desert. It was an engineering marvel, he said, and he was right. I remember the day they opened it, November 5th, 1913. We went into the city, all of us, my mother, Joshua, the children, and we stood with thousands of other people at the Cascades in the San Fernando Valley and watched the water come pouring down. It was this tremendous moment, this torrent of water arriving after all those years of work, and people were cheering and crying, and I held Ruth's hand. She was 9 years old, and I thought about how different her life would be from mine. She'd grow up in a city with unlimited water, with possibilities I'd never had. Los Angeles by then had over 319,000 people. The ranch was surrounded by the city now. The subdivisions had reached us and gone past us. The southern portion we'd sold, it was all houses, streets with names, a whole neighborhood called Highland Park where our cattle used to graze. I went to visit once, walked those streets, and it was strange. I could still see in my mind where the old oak tree had stood, where the creek used to run during the rainy season, but now there were houses and lawns and children playing in yards that used to be open land. I wasn't angry about it, not really. It was just change, and change comes whether you want it or not. My mother passed away in 1916. She was 73 years old, and she'd lived to see Los Angeles transform from a dusty pueblo into a major American city. I think she was proud of that, in her way, even though she missed the old days same as I did. And Hollywood? Well, that was something else entirely. The movie people started coming around 1911, building studios, making their pictures, and by the time the war ended in 1918, Hollywood was becoming famous all over the world. It seemed like every month there was something new, some new invention, some new building, some new way of living that made the old ways seem quaint and distant. I'm 94 years old now, sitting here in my daughter Ruth's house in Pasadena, and Los Angeles has become something I couldn't have imagined, even in my wildest dreams as a girl. 2.5 million people live here now, maybe more. The city stretches for miles and miles in every direction, all the way to the ocean, all the way to the mountains, neighborhoods and freeways and shopping centers covering what used to be open land. The ranch, our ranch, the northern portion we kept, well, I sold it finally in 1941. Joshua had passed away in 1948. The children were grown with families of their own, and I couldn't maintain it anymore. It's all houses now, streets and houses, and a shopping plaza where our orange groves used to be. Sometimes I drive by there, and I can barely recognize it, but if I close my eyes, I can still see it exactly as it was. I can still smell the orange blossoms in spring, that sweet, heavy scent that would drift through the whole property. I can still see my father sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the sun go down behind the hills. I can still hear my mother calling us in for supper. There are things I've wondered about all these years. I never knew what happened to Don Vicente Sepulveda, that old man who sold oranges at the plaza. One day in the early 90s, 1890 or maybe 91, he just wasn't there anymore, and I never found out if he died or moved away or what became of him. Small thing, I suppose, but it bothers me that I don't know. He was part of that old Los Angeles, that world before everything changed, and when he disappeared, it felt like another piece of the past just vanished without a trace. I don't regret the progress. My grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they have opportunities I never had. They live in a modern city with universities and hospitals and everything they could need. But I do miss the quietude, if that makes sense. I miss being able to stand on our land and hear nothing but wind and birds and maybe a cow lowing in the distance. I miss knowing every person I'd see when I went into town. I miss the slowness of it, the way time seemed to move differently back then. Los Angeles went from 5,700 people when I was born to nearly 2.5 million by 1960. I've watched it happen, year by year, and I'm one of the last people alive who remembers what it was before. That's why I'm telling this now, I suppose. Someone should remember. Someone should know that all of this enormous city, it used to be dust and orange groves and cattle ranches, and there were people who loved it that way, who built their lives in that quiet world before everything changed forever.